All right, well, hopefully everyone can hear me. I think we should be good to go. We're going to go ahead and start the presentation. So again, I want to first express thank you all for coming out tonight and engaging in this conversation. I think, as Eric said, it's definitely timely. It's something that is of great importance to society going in the future, but it's definitely a timely subject as we look at the current landscape in the world today. And I know that your time would probably be better spent looking at a TV screen, following what's going on across the world right now. And so I do want to appreciate you taking some moment of your day and night really to engage in this conversation. For those, again, I talked a little bit about it. My name is Thomas Hale. I'm the president of Friends of Mineralogy Virginia. I am currently a graduate student at George Washington University at the Elliott School of International Affairs. I'm also a student at the University of Delaware and Queensland University. For those that are saying, what? Yeah, it's 3 universities. It's a lot of different work, but I want to be in many places because this is an issue that goes across multiple boundaries, right? And so for me, I want to tackle it from a policy perspective, and that's why I'm in the security kind of school at the Elliott School. And then I also want to tackle it from a science perspective and this kind of industry focus. And that's why I'm at Delaware and Queensland, where we look at the extractive industry specifically. So my expertise, and I want to put that in quotes, right? Or what I study, I should say, in this mineral community is this, what I call the mineral security nexus. And so that's what our presentation is going to be about tonight. So I want to start our talk with this kind of chaotic screen here. And basically what I'm trying to get across in this first slide is that there's so much on the news right now about critical mineral supply chains and rare earth elements and securing America's supply chains. And when you look at everything out there on the news, it's kind of easy to get lost in all of the discussion. You have multiple perspectives from industry, as well as academia, as well as politics and security weighing in. So you've got a lot of different fields starting to talk about this issue that's definitely a pressing matter we're going to face for decades to come. But what I want to kind of come across at the start here is that although there's a lot of investment going on, although there's a lot of discussions and funding to write these reports about supply chains, there's still a lot of unknown variables. There's still a lot of things that we still need to learn about the supply chain, the sustainable mining practices. There's missing data. Not everything that you see and hear about is coming from a place of very sufficient data. I work currently on projects in the cobalt supply chain in Africa, as well as other projects in Afghanistan. And sure, you can talk about the Afghanistan mining sector, you can talk about the Congolese mining sector, but that doesn't mean that there's missing gaps and there's data gaps that we still have to get through. And there's also a lot of questions that are currently still unanswered when we look at this idea of the mineral security nexus or supply chain security. And so I just kind of want to leave that as the start, because when we engage in this discussion, it's just relevant to understand that if you're a young person or you're still interested in these topics, this is going to be something we're going to be dealing with for the coming decades. And it's a problem that's not just going to go away tomorrow. We're not going to snap our fingers with these investments and big infrastructure projects, and all of a sudden we have a secure supply chain. And so it's important that we understand going forward that there's still questions out there, and there's a lot of opportunity for people to get involved in this growing field. And that's why I'm really excited about it, because it is a growing field, and there's a lot of questions still to be left answered. So before I give the presentation, I always like to do kind of an overview. I want to first start with why minerals matter, which may be very basic for some of us who have always had a passion for minerals, mineralogy, and geology. But I think it's important to start at a baseline. What am I talking about when why we think of minerals matter to society? I then want to define this idea of the mineral security nexus. And it's something that I don't really see talked about much. You hear about conflict minerals and other things, but I want to kind of expand on that. Then we'll talk about some key issues that you're probably familiar with or have seen in the news: critical minerals, conflict minerals, rare earth elements. And then I want to include some other things that I think are left out of the dialogue and discussion, but I think are very, very relevant in tonight's presentation and moving forward. And then my unique contribution to this ongoing discussion that has a lot of incredible minds working on it is how we can explore global issues through the minerals themselves, the actual products, the elements, the specimens. And I call that mineral diplomacy, using minerals as a tool to engage in these larger issues facing society. We'll then talk briefly about the pathway or pathways forward. I mean, okay, we have these problems, but what we do? And then we'll take a quick break because it's going to be a lot of information for 1 minute just to gather our thoughts. And then I'll go into the White House roundtable discussion that happened on Wednesday and give you some key highlights to that, as well as engaging in some case studies. Of course, people wanted to talk a little bit about Ukraine. I'll talk about my work in Afghanistan and the DRC. And then most importantly, right, this is a discussion, so I want to have time for us to ask some questions and engage in a dialogue here at the end. And I do want to make sure as we start that I'm very clear that this presentation is solely focused on educating people about these issues. How do we talk about it from multiple different facets? No pun intended there, or pun intended. You know, how do we engage policymakers, the public, and academia? How do we talk about these things from multiple perspectives where it's still interesting for every single audience? And that's what I want to try to do tonight. So I'm not trying to say that this is the right political decision or we need to do this or that. I'm just simply trying to highlight these issues that we're facing and will be facing for quite some time. So let's start first with why minerals matter. So why do minerals matter? Well, in my opinion, minerals matter because without them, human civilization wouldn't have the quality of life and the technology that we have today. I mean, if you look at it, our great ancestors first used minerals or chert or flint to hunt for food. And so minerals have been a part of our life. If you do a thought experiment, you can even go back millions of years and talk about how geology impacted ancient animal migration. You can talk about how ancient sea creatures utilized calcite and aragonite in their shell to protect themselves against predators. Minerals are a key part of life. They're a key part of the universe, as well as the elements that make them up or in us as a human. And so, unfortunately, you know, I'm in a grad program, I'm out there talking to people. It actually comes up a lot that when I say minerals matter, people will say, well, can't we just get rid of minerals? Or isn't food more important or water more important? And sure, those things are important to life, and I'm not going to negate the seriousness of those issues when we look to climate change and other problems. But given the size of the population in the world the way that it is today, you wouldn't be able to get water to your house or food to your table without an industry that was built upon infrastructure that was made of minerals. And so at the core fundamental level of life, minerals do matter. But the real problem, you know, when I see it is that as technology advances, it's those raw materials that are used to create it and these different elements that become very abstract. You can look at a steam locomotive or like the kitchen equipment and appliances from the 1920s, and you could very easily see what went into making it. But in today's world, we have all these plastic coated appliances that have all the components internally and all these screens on it and everything like an electric vehicle. You can't really see and know what's inside of it. And so for the consumer, it becomes very abstract. And so you see this disconnect from why minerals matter and knowing that they're part of our life to actually the consumer that just looks at it as a product and not something that goes all the way back to coming from a mine site. And if you want to give like a bottom line up front, or why does this really matter, the bluff, it's that global demand for these critical materials or minerals, whatever you want to call it, is set to skyrocket by 400 to 600% over the next several decades. This is going to be a problem of demand and supply. And that's really what we're concerned about right now. And so we want to achieve this green future. We want to be able to mitigate and adapt to climate change. But those materials needed to do that. Right now, it's very difficult to look out 10 years and say we have enough supplies to meet that demand. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And when we think about minerals, we just don't want to look at it as all they make things. There are key components in, of course, decarbonizing our global infrastructure. They're key to mitigating and adapting to climate change and that energy transition. They're also important in conflict zones for funding insurgency groups. While they may not be the sole use or the sole reason for conflict, they do act as threat multipliers to conflict zones. And of course, consumerism, the idea of we have to have a new iPhone every year. We have to have a new laptop every year. Obsolescence and these different issues of e-waste. Those are problems as a consumer we need to start thinking about because that directly relates to our ability to have enough supply of these critical materials. And so while mining is going to be key for the future, it's really important for us to study other issues too, such as substitutes. A colleague from mine in South Dakota School of Mines always said he tells his students that we have a set palette, the periodic table. And each of those elements have unique chemical and physical properties. And you can't just swap out things here and there. It really does become difficult when you have to be very creative to trying to substitute a specific element or removing it completely from a use, like removing cobalt from EVs. We're also looking at alternative sourcing. Can we get it from coal ash tailings? Can we get it from other areas? The environmental safety aspects, recycling, and of course that idea of the circular economy that we really want to strive to achieve as a society. How do we at the end life of a product reintegrate that back into the supply chain and not just have a bunch of e-waste where these materials are not utilized to actually go back into the system and not require so much mining in the future? And I guess the last point here is that some minerals become less or more important over time. Let's go back and take a time machine and talk to someone 100 years ago and say, tell me about rare earths. Well, they're not going to see rare earths as like the key thing back then. It was going to be other metals and steel and iron and other things. And so today, rare earths and cobalt and lithium are important, and they may be important going into the next couple of decades, but let's not forget or be complacent that some metals and materials may all of a sudden, when new technology comes up, be important in 30 to 40 years. So we have to think holistically when we approach this problem. So now let's back up and let's define this mineral security nexus. I'm still working on the definition here, but I define this mineral security nexus as the increasing importance of minerals and environmental, human, and national security issues, and the consequences of security dynamics on the ability to acquire critical minerals safely, consistently, and securely. And those are really important things at the end there. And so national security, human security, and environmental security, they all have their own experts, they all have their own agencies working on those problems. But when we get into this energy transition and we look at the emerging threats of the future, we're really in need of people and scientists and policymakers that can be flexible, that can understand multiple different issues. So this is really where it comes down to, that we can't just look at these things in their own silos or their own bubbles. It requires us to think creatively and to look outside our comfort zone, whether we're a national security expert or focus on human development, or we're an environmental expert. We have to integrate everything together if we want to find solutions. So we look at national security, you hear this a lot in the news, that's economic competitive behavior, how can Americans still be competitive in the future in this energy transition? You hear a lot about US and China competition, which is a big fear. For a lot of people, China has a huge dominance in the supply chain. How do we reduce that? What are the threats behind that? Vulnerabilities, diversification strategies, the military and defense sector, of course, are really, really interested. And what are these materials and why do they matter to our technology used in missiles, used in advanced technology for the military to keep competitive on the battlefield? And of course, strategic stockpiling, which we'll talk a little bit about in the White House roundtable brief. We have human security, which unfortunately, in the midst of all this global demand and supply, gets left under the rug sometimes. But there's a lot of problems that result from mineral extractive industries, such as child labor, such as human and sex trafficking, which is something we're looking at currently in the Congo. The financing of civil wars or insurgency groups as threat multipliers, not necessarily the key issue in that conflict. Health and safety. A lot of these mining operations and artisanal small-scale operations are very unsafe. A lot of times it degrades the local community and their water systems. And there's a huge amount of transparency concerns when it comes to other companies operating abroad. And of course, lastly, and really the kind of larger scheme here is this idea of environmental security, climate change, pollution, resource conflict, the concern of resource nationalism as countries see the increasing price of some of these metals. And then again, the electric transition and energy and technology. So that's why the way that I see this mineral security nexus is a much broader, more integrative approach, not just something that's specifically in one area or facet of the government. So now let's look at some of the key issues, and we'll start with critical minerals. Critical minerals are the new kid on the block. They are something that hasn't been around for a long time in terminology, but are something that combines all of the conflict minerals and other rare earth minerals. They're all different in their issues, and we'll talk about that, but critical minerals are something you're going to hear a lot in the news. So critical minerals are defined as minerals deemed critical to both the economic and national security of the country. They're important for specialized applications, that they are at risk for supply disruption. I'm being a little bit picky here. I tell the folks at USGS this, I kind of pick at them. You know, minerals are technically a misnomer. While some of these are actual minerals, a lot of these are elements or metals, right? They're not technically a mineral. Minerals are a lot more complex. They have multiple different elements and combinations to go in to the actual minerals and ores that we collect or mine. But a lot of these are specifically elements or metals. And so it's just important to think about that. I've talked to folks at Colorado School of Mine and others that have worked on this issue for years, and the terminology critical minerals mostly comes from the post-World War II era, where you had strategic minerals. And when this topic was picked up again around 2009 or so, the people that were in the room had been used to hearing strategic minerals, and so critical sounded better. It sounded more essential to government function. So they went with critical minerals, even though technically people call it technology metals, critical materials, or critical metals. So what defines a supply risk? Well, USGS has their own methodology that they use. They update it so often, so it's not something that's like a monolithic structure that stays the same. It always changes. One key issue is a single point of failure in the supply chain. Maybe we have one specific mine that, if disrupted, could create a supply disruption. You also have concentrated markets, whether something, again, is concentrated in China. We can go up to the top here and look at our night vision goggles given to a US Navy SEAL. Well, I don't know, but if you start looking at it, a lot of these metals are coming from China. There's a concentration in that market, and so that's deemed a supply risk if there was a threat of conflict in the future. But we can expand that a little bit more too, to political risk, to collapsing governments and fragile regimes. We can expand it to cybersecurity threats, not only on governments, but also on mining operations as they become more automized. We can look at it as geohazards. What happens if an earthquake or a volcano or a massive flood? Some of these effects, like flooding due to climate change, could impact mining operations. And then lastly, we have COVID-19, which I think all of us who's experienced the last 3 years, it feels like 100 years, knows that global pandemics can completely disrupt global supply chains. And so criticality, though, it's really interesting. So criticality is country specific, and it's fluid depending on the market and technology trends. So it's temporal. So it depends on who is asking the question. So the US can ask the question and they ask it in 2020. But it may be very different if Japan asked the same question in 2020. And if the US asks which mineral should be critical in 2025, that can completely change which ones are. So it's a time variable there, and there's also who is asking that question. So it's important to keep that in mind. Private industry also has their own criticality assessments, a lot of this proprietary knowledge. So Intel may come out, or GE, and say, hey, these are the critical elements in our supply chain. Well, how did you get there? Well, we can't tell you, but we can tell you which ones are critical. They could also look very different from the government. Of course, China dominates this industry since the 90s. For those that have lived through this, you saw the dissolution of the Bureau of Mines. You saw a change from mining over to other carbon-based economies. I'll just put it that way. And this really is a multifaceted issue. So it's not just extraction, or what we call the upstream. It's also processing at the midstream and manufacturing at the downstream. And China not only controls a lot of these different upstream to downstream on key metals, they are a dominant player in all of these fields. But processing is something that comes up a lot, and what you'll see as a recurrent theme in a lot of these discussions. Our ability to process and separate and get these metals and elements into a form that they're usable in industry. 2018 was our first critical mineral list. We had 35, and now we have it to 50 total commodities. That list was released on Wednesday, so very relevant. The platinum group metals and the rare earth elements were separated, so that's why the list kind of got inflated. Zinc and nickel were added to the list. We can talk about that if people have questions as to why. Helium, strontium, potash, and rhenium were removed, and also uranium. Uranium was removed because it's considered a fuel mineral, and that is not deemed a critical mineral. I will say one last thing too about critical mineral list. I do have some critiques. These lists are great for identifying what is a critical mineral, but they don't do much to say what to do about it, right? Like it's one thing to identify supply risk of key metals and minerals or elements, but it's another to actually make policy action and see what the issues are. And so USGS does not claim to do that. Their core function is to identify criticality, not to say something else. So government agencies have the right to take these critical mineral lists and do with it as they please. They may do nothing. They may do a lot. They may only focus on a couple metals. They may focus on all the metals. That is an issue. And that's some of the work that I work on, is how do we create more expansive methodologies that includes criticality assessments to make smarter policy action for government agencies, because the critical mineral methodology that USGS uses is a little math intensive, and that can sometimes be an obstacle when we try to translate that science to the policymaking community. For those of you that are not familiar with the National Minerals Information Center, I highly recommend Nassar and his team over there are wonderful. This mineral commodity summaries report that is done every year, it's different than the list that I was just talking about that was released, is a wealth of knowledge. I mean, I read this thing about 3 times a week, if not more. It's fantastic. It goes through all the different elements, talks about all these different commodities, their import reliance, where they're located, the different strategic reserves and countries, and talks about technology trends and market trends over the last year. So highly recommend looking at this. One of the things they added this year was this 20-year trend in US import reliance for critical minerals, which is pretty fascinating because you can see by these little small bar graphs down here how import reliance has shifted over the years. So things like carbon, fluorine have been 100% import reliance over the last 20 years, where things like aluminum have actually decreased around 30% due to recycling capabilities. And so this is a really interesting graph. I love to use this with school groups and others because it shows you how we've responded and changed to industry issues around net import reliance. But if you look at this, you can tell we still have a lot of net import reliance on a lot of key commodities critical to the US government. Other countries, I love Canada's list. I love the maple leaf. That's just so cool. I think we need to do something like that. Unfortunately, we don't have any really cool graphics, but Canada, you know, they're doing a good job. The EU also has their own critical minerals action plan. You can see kind of a flow analysis of where these things are going into and where they deem very high priority, which of course are their rare earth industry, and their low priority, which is like manganese, chromium, zirconium, and others. Again, every country has a different list, and so that's important to keep in mind. For the mineral collectors in the room, we love to look at these beautiful specimens, but it's also kind of gratifying to understand how some of those beautiful minerals that we have in our collections actually have elements that are key to strategic, economic, and national security priorities. And so it's a far-fetched, right, to take a mineral specimen and say, oh, look, security. But hey, that's really cool to show someone vanadium or vanadinite, and then to show someone fluorite or beryllium and beryl, and to be able to connect those dots. Again, that's not to say that these beautiful minerals are what are being destroyed every day at a mining operation. That's actually not what's occurring. Most of this is very ugly ore and other things, but minerals do occur and minerals do get destroyed in that process, but they are still kind of the pure forms in which we can educate about these issues. So now let's shift gears to conflict minerals. And conflict minerals have been around for a little bit longer. You can kind of go back and talk a little bit about conflict diamonds. That's kind of where you start hearing this conversation. Of course, that got nipped in the bud when Leonardo DiCaprio and others made movies about it. So when it got to Hollywood, we started making change. But that just goes to show you the power of engaging in society and education on some of these critical issues. And so conflict minerals refer to raw materials or minerals that come from a particular part of the world where conflict is occurring and it affects the mining and trading of those materials or minerals. And the key component here is funding. And where that funding goes is normally to a local warlord to fund insurgency operations against the state actor. So these are non-state actors funding through mineral resources. This special case of conflict minerals is very, very localized. It's 2010 Dodd-Frank Act, Section 1502. and it classifies 3 TG, tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold, specifically in the Congo. And so while conflict minerals can be seen from a lot of different countries, and a lot of nonprofit groups would connect conflict, or especially around gold and other metals, to human security issues, and US code and legal language, which we can debate that, it's technically only tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold. And for the mineral collectors here, that's primarily cassiterite, tantalite, columbite, wolframite, and of course, gold. I'm working currently on projects in the Congo, and something that comes up a lot is that there's a lot of people at the State Department, Department of Labor, and other agencies that have a background in conflict minerals because it's been an issue for many years, and they especially come from the Kimberley process with diamonds. And so sometimes we see cobalt and copper and other minerals called conflict minerals, but they're not conflict minerals as classified by the Dodd-Frank Act. Now there's a lot of research being conducted, my team included, on how can we look at conflict and its connection to some of these other metals. You know, maybe they're not funding insurgency groups, but that's a very, specific definition when you can definitely consider that cobalt and copper definitely go into the hands of some very nefarious actors that do relate back to conflict in the eastern parts of the Congo. So just to keep that in mind, that 3TG is what we consider conflict minerals under the code of Section 1502. OECD has a good report, but we don't have much time to talk about that. Talk a lot about due diligence. Key policy issues here, of course, is traceability. Can you trace back something that was manufactured, understand all the material that went into making that across multiple nodes of that supply chain, all the way back to the Congo? That is very difficult. And companies have really not cared about doing that for years. This is an issue that they're only now looking at. And so to be able to trace things back is very hard. You hear a lot about blockchain technology, LIBS, or laser-induced breakdown spectroscopy, which is really fascinating, to see if we can trace these things and geofingerprint them back to their original site of extraction. Very difficult, not easy, but it's happening. We also hear a lot about formalization on this artisanal small-scale mining. We hear a lot about expansion of a list from a lot of NGOs, and of course, sourcing protocols for industry and auditing of mine sites. USAID goes out to mine sites and says, yeah, this is safe, they're not using child labor, but that's not to say that 10 minutes later they bring the kids back in. So there's a lot of concerns about certification, auditing, and sourcing from key sites in the Congo. You can also trade this material like 10 times. For those of us that are mineral collectors and know a lot about Afghanistan minerals, it may not be coming from someone from Afghanistan in Tucson, but you go back 10 hands after it's been traded, maybe they're related to the Taliban. You never know, but it comes up sometimes. And then lastly, we want to talk about rare earth elements. So rare earth elements have taken a lot of the spotlight in the security communities because of their wide importance. They're used in so many different applications, from the defense sector just to everyday technology. They're comprised of 15 lanthanides. We also include yttrium and scandium due to their similar properties. That's 17 total elements. They're also not rare. That terminology is very archaic, but it's stuck. So here we are in 2022 trying to convince people that rare earth elements are not rare. History just happens that way sometimes. A lot of this was dated back to some European mining operations where they found these unique rocks. They called them rare, and then earth just related to oxides. And so rare earth elements, that term kind of stuck. But again, they're not rare. It's just very hard to process and extract them. And so that's the difficulty there, but still not rare. They are in a lot of places across the world. For the US government, it was 2010 where a drunk trawler entered Japanese waters in the Senkaku Island, which is a disputed territory. That caused an arrest, which then created a diplomatic dispute that disrupted the market. There was a lot of talk about embargoes, but if that actually happened, there's a lot of debate around that, but it didn't really matter because the market spiked, businesses realized and government realized China has a dominance in this supply chain. And so that rare earth issue really is when government started to talk about these issues. And being in DC, I get a lot of discussion when I say critical minerals and they say, oh, rare earths? So people know this terminology, not the other metals, unfortunately, but they definitely know this. Cobalt and lithium are getting there. We are import reliant on REEs. As of the White House report, China controls 87% of the global permanent magnet market. This is still a major concern. Even though we mine rare earths out of Mountain Pass mine in California, we still send them to China to process. And so that's a huge problem that we're trying to shore up currently. There's several projects, including Alliance, which is an Australian rare earth company, looking at a project in Texas to refine. The DOE is also looking into our rare earth extraction into the coal ash and mine waste in Pennsylvania and other previous coal states. And of course, there's this new investment in MP materials. The key issue here, of course, is the lack of domestic processing. It's the heavy rare earth and light rare earth debate. We can talk about this in the Q&A. I've seen some really interesting discussions over the last couple of days where people are criticizing the US investment into MP materials, not just given its interesting past, let's say, not with the current company, but the previous. There actually is some Chinese equity in the mining operation in Mountain Pass, but it's the fact that most of the material is light rare earth elements, not technically heavy. And in the White House report, they say heavy rare earth extraction. And so we're going to have to see how much they're expecting to get out of that yield and that deposit. Right now, I don't know. And it's not looking like they're going to get much heavy rare earths, but we could be surprised. And then lastly, unlike the other critical minerals that we could actually maybe solve some of those issues for the US, we have enough here to meet our demand, but unfortunately, China is the main player when it comes to rare earth elements. They have the largest ore reserves, over 44 million metric tons, which is the largest ore deposit in the world. Again, this shows you all the various applications. Of course, this is 2013 from USGS. The percentage I would say is mostly going into metallurgy now. Of course, catalyst is still important, but you can see that it's used in so many different applications, even wastewater treatment, clean energy, catalytic converters, pollution scrubbers. Rare earths are that broadly used material that is very important to society. It's actually used in the computer screens that you're talking and engaging with me right now. So then lastly, before we get into the pathways and take a small break, because I know I'm throwing a lot of information at you, I want to talk about other critical issues. Right now, FMVA, we're engaged with their aggregate partners out here in the state because we understand that if you're wanting to build the smart cities of the future and you're wanting to have strong transportation systems for those electric vehicles, you have to have good aggregate material. You have to invest in that sector because aggregate is a local industry. It's not economically viable to ship aggregate from far away. So they have the highest community impact just given their need to be close in proximity to local communities, which provides a unique avenue for engaging with people about why mining is important. We also look at cybersecurity in minerals. I always freak people out when I start talking about the metals and materials that go into making their cyber programs. And they're like, oh, I just thought I'm in the cyber world. And many times we forget as a society, we're all digitally based, but we forget of that material that grounds us to the earth. And so in many cases, yes, you need metals to get cybersecurity infrastructure to keep competitive with other countries. But as mines become more automized, whether it's safety or efficiency, they're more susceptible to cyber threats. And that's just not an issue you hear talked about a lot. We'll talk a little about this with Ukraine, but what role do nuclear plants play in the energy transition as baseload power, and how do geopolitical debates around non-proliferation and all these other issues either stifle progress or not, depends on your opinion on this matter. But nuclear energy still plays a massive role in this discussion. We're seeing that play out, especially with Ukraine and Germany right now, given Russian gas dependency. And then lastly, this is kind of a far off thing to think about, but what role will minerals have in space policy and technology? All these satellites that go up need minerals, and we're looking at space programs and NASA and Tesla and all, SpaceX, you name it. What goes into those devices? Do we know? Do we know those supply chains? And more importantly, if we're going to have this overwhelming population increase continue in the next couple of decades, is there opportunities to mine in space? What does that look like? How is that going to operate? These are questions that may seem like a science fiction thing for now, but as societies grow, and if you want to get philosophical, you may have to go out into space to mine some of these things. And one of my colleagues at University of Delaware she wrote a book on From Terrestrial Subsoils to Lunar Landscapes. And she actually looked at some of the mineral deposits on the moon, which is pretty exciting. And last month, we just had Shauna Morrison from the Carnegie Institute to come talk about the mineralogy of Mars, which is really fascinating. So these are issues you don't see, but could become larger and larger of importance when we start looking at these mineral issues. And so the pathways forward. Well, if you look at what we want to accomplish, which is getting to these climate goals, if we want to reach our individual country plans, we're going to have to mine more than 2 times the amount of current minerals to reach our 2030 plans. Biden administration came out with, this is how many EVs we want by 2025. At the event I was at, they said that they could actually get 500,000 electric vehicles every year by 2025. That's a hefty number, especially when we haven't shored up some of these supply chains. So where are those metals coming from? Maybe we can manufacture them, but that doesn't mean that those materials aren't coming from China or coming from other areas where maybe child labor is involved. We have a lot of issues before we reach that point. The Paris Climate Accord, you're going to have to see a 4-fold in mineral production, and by 2050, a 6-fold in mineral production. So the future is mineral intensive, but we have a lot of obstacles. That includes public education, permitting timeline, which is a key issue right now in the US, trying to reduce those permits while still keeping economic and environmental sustainability, domestic processing capability, shoring that up and having a midstream supply chain for these processing technologies here in the US. A lot of that, though, is a problem because there's not many students that know about these technologies. When I was at Virginia Tech University, pretty much everyone that I knew that was a friend around me was doing oil and petroleum geology. They were not metal mining people. Now you're starting to see a shift in education in these geology departments to actually focus on metallurgy, to focus on mining engineering, and all these other critical issues. And so training is critical and recruitment is critical. Not many people right now want to be in the mining sector. They see very poorly of it. And so engaging in that conversation is critical to meeting these future demands. China and US competition can, of course, disrupt a lot of this. And of course, public opinion, or what we call the NIMBY principle, or not in my backyard. Not wanting to mine domestically, but wanting to mine abroad, even if it may hurt the environment in the large scheme because there's less environmental protocols and policies and regulations in other countries. I've worked on the Coalsville uranium deposit here in Virginia, and that was a key issue. Critical considerations, though, is environmental protection, ethical practices, indigenous rights, the social license to operate, not just at the beginning of the operation, but throughout that process. You can't just have a social license to operate and everyone's happy, and then all of a sudden, 5 years later, you're like, okay, well, they agreed to us mining, and now we're just going to screw up the environment. No, you have to have that social contract from the beginning to the end of that operation. Conflict resolution. This is a skill set of negotiation that not many people are training others, but we need to have environmental conflict negotiators. We need to have people that can get into these communities, engage, and have the skill sets necessary to discuss these multidiscipline issues with indigenous groups and marginalized communities. And that's the concern here, is that if we need these metals for security issues, then we're going to start messing up the environment because we need them right now. And so the time to act is now, because if we don't, then we're going to mess up later. So how do we overcome these issues, or my central thesis? We have to use minerals to explore those global issues. So the time has come for us to reframe the minerals as part of a problem to part of the solution. We know that every rock has a story, whether it's from that geological creation to its extraction and its end use. And that story is often lost, never told, or improperly framed. For hundreds of years, humans have used art to express racial inequality, to express other societal issues. So why not use natural art, or the products and the materials that we mine, to educate and engage communities? People are fascinated with natural history. They go to museums every year, but that is a community that is not tapped into in its full potential within this critical mineral discussion. That is a community that I strive hard to nurture and grow. So minerals have to be viewed through a cross-discipline approach, because Without that, we can't reframe curriculum. I know so many teachers over COVID that are focused on their standards of learning testing, and they are not putting in critical minerals or energy technology and energy security into their classrooms. They don't even have these materials. They don't have any connections with the government and USGS. They don't know about the mineral commodity reports. And part of what we do at FMBA is connecting classrooms across the state with that literature, with that information, so they can be informed educators for young scientists that are going to go out into the world and tackle these problems that we're going to face over the next couple of decades. And we can do this through minerals, because the industry and policymakers always say, we want more public buy-in, we want more support. Why can't we get it? Well, have you thought about using what you mine to educate? And that's really what I think it comes down to. And so that's what I call mineral diplomacy. Using minerals as a tool for public engagement, helping support industry, helping reframe curriculum and develop it to understand these cross-cutting issues, getting into the policy and public education communities, understanding how we make sure curriculum reflects the issues in the future. Because right now, so many people that are educators in their earth science classroom are doing, test the streak and the hardness of this mineral. Can you identify these 10 minerals? That's not important for kids. What kids need to understand is, how do minerals impact their life? How do you mine sustainably? Identifying 10 minerals may be great for the mineralogist in the future, but it's not great for the overwhelming part of the population that are never going to get engaged in the mineral field, but would benefit from understanding these problems at a very young age. And that is a huge thing. And then, of course, supporting our domestic mining infrastructure and processing, because we can mine safely here. We have the technology to do it. We just have to invest in it. And that's really what it comes down to, is making sure we look at these technologies that can be sustainable in the future. And then there's the role of the mineral community, which is getting our community engaged in this discussion. We often see it as a policy issue, a security issue, or an industry problem. But what about the public? What about those stakeholders that aren't at the table? We get the local community to come in, we get the indigenous group to come in, but are we really taking in that broad perspective into our mining operations? Are we really looking at this as a society perception of mining? In many cases, we don't. And so I say that the local communities, these schools and these families and these educators could use minerals as a tool to educate. And we've done that with FMBA and FM. Aaron, who's a talented artist who's created some of these programs here and these posts, and Jessica have done a phenomenal job at FM National at engaging the public. This geology of a pencil post, while it's not all detailed in depth, it's a simple graphic. That graphic got over 270,000 views. It was shared over 400 times. And that got into USGS and other agencies from a small nonprofit community. That is the high impact. That is changing these voters. That is getting this and moving the ball on these issues. And that is really what we need. It is the process by which we engage is what we want to try to do. And I believe the mineral community can do that. So I'm sure you're all asleep. I'm sure you're tired and exhausted. I want us to just take a moment, gather our thoughts. There was a lot of information coming at you. And I know it's 44 minutes. We normally have an hour, so I got 15 minutes to go. I want to just impress on those as we digest this, that these issues are complex and they're not something that we can just solve tonight. It's not something we can just understand tonight. Some of us are very engaged in this dialogue. We're very focused on this. And some of us may be coming into it for the first time. But the real key takeaway is that we all, no matter what we do, whether it's in the industry, whether it's the policy community, whether it's the environmental community, we all have a passion for minerals. We all care about minerals. And it's that common ground that can unite us to make change, because in my opinion, minerals are one of the most bipartisan issues facing us in the future. And if we can do this sustainably and we can work together and we can find common ground, minerals are literally, in many ways, part of the solution to the energy transition, but part of the solution to healing some of these divisions, because they are part of a shared future, whether it's jobs in the East Coast and the old coal communities, or it's advanced green technologies. This is what we need to go for, because we all share that passion. So that's a lot of information. I'm going to keep going on with some information, but these are going to be highlights. So bear with me, we're getting there. And I appreciate you because this is a very, very broad overview of these topics. So last Wednesday, or I guess this Wednesday, time is not important anymore in COVID. We had a roundtable for the White House with different agencies and groups there. It was on securing a made in America supply chain for critical minerals. This was after the executive order last year, 14017, which is America's supply chains. It had a 100-day supply chain review on the critical mineral supply chain. In 2021, they came out with a report, which to many of us was no surprise. They were over-reliant on many foreign sources and adversaries for our critical mineral materials. And that posed an economic and national security risk. So while there's still a lot of challenges, there's been a lot of developments. The first one is that MP Materials, the Mountain Pass mine, has been given $35 million to help separate and process heavy rare earth elements. Again, we can talk about where are they coming from. They're also going to invest another $700 million in their operation to close a full circle on extraction, processing, and getting it to manufacturing. However, where's the manufacturing here in the US? So again, there's still loopholes in here. BHE Renewables is also announcing that they're going to have a demonstration facility in Imperial County, California, to test commercial viability of their sustainable lithium extraction from geothermal brine. This is a huge step forward. If successful, they could commercially produce around 90,000 metric tons of lithium per year, perfect for batteries, so it's the grade that would be used in batteries, by around 2026 or 2030. Redwood Materials is also talking with Volvo and others and Ford to create recycling and end-of-life lithium-ion batteries at its Nevada-based facilities. They're also setting up a recycling facility in Tennessee. Some of you are here from the DOE, or some of you have worked with the DOE in Pennsylvania, and you know that there's also $140 million in investment for another demonstration project, which is the key term here. Doesn't mean they'll be successful, but they are projects through the bipartisan infrastructure bill to recover rare earths and other critical minerals such as cobalt from coal ash and other mine waste. There's also $3 billion other funding and investing in this kind of battery materials. We also saw that Tesla came out after not being acknowledged for a long time. They're going to source their high-grade nickel from the Talon Metals Company in Minnesota from their nickel project. And then most broadly and importantly, we're going to update our outdated mining regulations. And mining laws, that's 150 years old from 1872. However, this is where community engagement really, really matters. We need to make sure that the public is in these meetings and that we're going to these things. So if you're interested in this topic, I highly recommend. They're going to have a lot of working group public information sessions that you can go to and bring up these issues, because it is important that this is for federal public lands. So we want to make sure we do it sustainably and we don't get overzealous in our need for the demand of these critical minerals. We're also updating the USGS list, which I already talked about, and then strengthening our stockpiling. So basically shoring up some of these critical elements and making sure we have that in our stockpile. Oh, sorry for that. I don't know why that jumped. All right, so Ukraine. So people wanted to talk about Ukraine. There's a few issues that are going on currently. So Russia plays a main role in the aluminum market. Around 2018, there were some US sanctions that disrupted the market. However, it kind of was flexible, went back, but right now we're seeing record highs in aluminum prices due to the uranium crisis. So that's something that's out there being discussed. Russia also represents 40% of the refined palladium, which of course is used in catalytic converters. We also saw that Germany was hesitant to engage in some of these operations because they were relying on Russian gas after closing down a lot of their nuclear plants. So kind of this nexus between a carbon economy and a mineral-based economy, and realizing that energy transition isn't just cut and dry, it's a process. And if you do it fast and you have to still be relying on oil and gas sometimes, you can mess up strategically. This was brought to my attention, and I didn't know about this, but 90% of US semiconductor grade neon that's used in lasering of these semiconductors comes from Ukraine. So there are actually technical experts in a lot of these issues in that region for Russia. That's a byproduct of Russian steel manufacturing, and it's processed in Ukraine. So this future relationship of what happens after this invasion will determine maybe where we source. Now, a lot of companies have come out and said, don't worry, we have enough stockpile, we have enough diversification that this isn't going to be an issue. So we can talk about Ukraine as disrupting the supply chain, but we can also review Ukraine as how do we emphasize resilience. So maybe there were some things companies did right, given the political instability that was going on for the last couple months. So maybe we can learn from how we can assess these things as they're happening. There's also a couple questions, will this push European countries tighter to renewables to offset Russian gas dependency? Maybe we'll see that, maybe we won't. It's a question that we can ask after this. How can we also, again, use the Ukrainian case study to apply and assess supply chain resilience as well as vulnerability? I won't have time for this because I do want to talk about the other two projects really briefly before we get into questions. On LinkedIn, I made this post. There's a lot of really cool, significant reserves and deposits in Ukraine. They're no small player. I think it's very, sorry about that. I think it's very interesting to see how we don't think about these areas until something bad happens. And that really shows that there's a vulnerability in our understanding of supply chains where all of a sudden tomorrow we get surprised and say, oh, wow, maybe we should have started looking at this because it became an issue. And so there's a huge need in government, which is what we're working on, to create a methodology and framework, a practical framework for agencies to understand how do we look at these from a policy perspective and assess countries' capabilities, their supply chains before something bad happens, before there's a disruption. And right now we don't really see that. In the DRC, I'm working on a project currently with the State Department through my school. For those that may not know, our title of our project is a practical analysis of the cobalt supply chain for US government agencies. We're trying, again, to develop that methodology, which asks key specific questions, key data analysis, scenario planning, and other things that we can do that can be replicated across elements and across different countries. China dominates 80% of the cobalt industry currently in the Congo. They also dominate most of the processing, if not all, depending on the country. It accounts for 50% of China's imports of the DRC's output of cobalt. Congo represents 70% of the cobalt market, so they're no small player. It is a concentrated market. The copper deposits, though, are actually in the south, so they're not actually getting cobalt specifically. They're actually mining copper, and then the cobalt's a byproduct. So it's like bang for your buck. You're getting cobalt from your copper process, which is really interesting. There's a big push, though, to remove cobalt from the supply chain for electric vehicles. However, we don't know if that's going to change from the batteries that go on your cell phone and laptops. That's a question that still needs to be answered. And so one of the things our team is doing is some scenario planning. What if cobalt is at its status quo demand? What if it does increase by 400%? Or what if it decreases because it's removed from the EV market? All of those things are going to change how the people in the Congo react to that and how these artisanal small-scale mining communities have to deal with it. We're also doing some mapping of child labor and human trafficking. There's a lot of sex trafficking. In interviews with some of the miners here, this is not from me, so I'm not going to disclose who that was, but on the ground interviews, not from kids, so this is an ethical issue, but from adults. When they get their money from mining operations, we're trying to make it responsible sourcing thing. And a lot of the times, the three things they get, they buy alcohol, they buy prostitutes, or they go and gamble. And so how do we create economic and educational opportunities for these people so that they can get out of that and that we don't have to have kids? And it's really those socioeconomic issues that are at the basis of the Congo that's a big problem. And that's why a lot of people go to mine. ASM production is actually no small value in cobalt. It's actually 30%, it's a rough estimate, of the cobalt supply chain is based upon artisanal small-scale mining. So that's small, but it's not insignificant. And then there's also some interesting work being done with USGS that we're doing some work with them now on actually analyzing the evolution of artisanal small-scale deposits. We look at these big operations to understand how those deposits evolve as they're being extracted, but no one really pays attention to ASMs because there's not much data. So using LiDAR and other satellite technologies, how can we see how miners are mining our small scale deposits, how they evolve, Does their equipment change? Do they have to use different materials? Does it become more dangerous? Those are some really interesting issues that are not really discussed. Moral of the story here, data is severely lacking and there's a lot of problems, but we're trying to shore that up. And then lastly is Afghanistan. And I can answer more questions in the chat because I know we're at 55 minutes here, but I just wrote a chapter for the British Geological Society on Afghanistan's mineral fortune prospects for fueling a green transition. That may seem like a field dream for many people. There's very, very serious issues in Afghanistan. However, there's a lot of opportunity to utilize mineral resources as an economic lever to get out of the situation the country's in. USGS estimates from around 2010, 900 billion. You're going to see a lot of people in the news say 1 trillion or 1.2 trillion. You need more data. You need more assessments. It's a conflict zone. So they're not necessarily out there getting the best amount of data as possible. It's very on the ground, limited field work and mineral exploration. The Helmand province here is where you have these rare earth reserves that people talk about a lot. In the Logar province, you had the Messanak copper deposit, which is a big contested deposit since 2008 after the Chinese mining companies bought up equity in that for 30-year contracts. And they haven't been able to actually extract there because of the war. And as well, the US was leveraging the archaeological Buddhist temples that they found on top of the copper deposit to stop the Chinese from mining. So it's been very interesting to see how we use archaeology to stop Chinese mining operations in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, the Taliban at the time were attacking Afghan archaeologists and bombing them at the site. One of my research specifically was digging deeper into this Tufts University's research, which identified mineral production potential scores for Afghanistan. So this map on the right is the USGS 24 or 23 areas of interest, or AOIs. In Afghanistan, Tufts University actually looked at road systems, water infrastructure, and all these different things to designate 6 provinces that had the highest mineral production potential score. And then what I did is I used water as a metric to hone in of which of those provinces that have a high mineral production score are the most vulnerable to water insecurity, because water is a huge problem in Afghanistan. And so it's a huge issue. This country has a lot of problems, but in many ways, minerals can be that future. And then China, of course, has several strategic interests here. Uyghur repression on the border is a common theme we're seeing with the Taliban cracking down on Uyghur militants. We'll put that in quotes. They share a 76-kilometer border with China, as you can see up here. That would actually reduce pressure in the South China Seas for the Chinese. It would open up a land corridor route to key mineral supplies because China is still dominant on many sea routes. So Afghanistan is very strategic for them, but it's also strategic for other countries. But if the past is to be any indicator for the future, or the present, I guess, we're not necessarily engaged in this country right now. A lot of the projects at USGS shut down after the withdrawal. A lot of the material was removed from online. The maps were removed from online, partly due to the fact that the US does not want other countries to see that information anymore. And there's a lot of troubled history with this Task Force for Stability Operations from the Department of Defense, but we can talk a little bit more about that. But again, that was a lot, and we're right at 1 hour, which is the time here. So I want to first, again, thank everybody. If you have any questions or you want to get involved in any conversation, I'm happy to have that discussion. And we'll just open it up to a forum. Please feel free to chat, turn on your video, and we'll have the conversation.